super scared of the ACLU. I only one? No. And we were just going around and heard all these people at ACLU in the room here. I'm like, oh my God, I gotta be out of here.
You're the only one afraid of ACLU and worms.
You have to confront your fears, so maybe that's what today's panel is about, me confronting my fears of the ACLU.
Sit right here.
No, not even. I'm surprised I'm even standing next to you. Jim Franklin, who's I've known for a number of years, sent an email not too long ago saying, hey, we've got some people in town at ACLU, and Jim's familiar with the Thrive Series. He's one of our earlier speakers in it, and suggested it might be a good topic. I sent it to Rachel, and Rachel was quick to say, yeah, let's give it a try. It sounds like a great topic. I went, really? So I said, yes, I went with her recommendation, and here we are today. Dan Caruso, the chairman and CEO of Zayo Group, and one of the co-founders, and been in and around telecom. And telecom, of course, has been at the epicenter of cybersecurity for many, many years. And if anything, it seems to be accelerating, so it has a relevance to our business. So I'm going to let each of you introduce yourselves, tell a little bit about yourselves, and then we'll get started.
So hi everyone, thank you for coming. It's always nice to speak to a packed room. My name is Chris Soghoian. I'm the principal technologist with the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology project, and basically what that means is my job is to speak English to lawyers about technology. I explain things for a living.
And I'm Phil Weiser, Dean of the Law School, Executive Director of the Silicon Flatirons Center for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship. And my job is to educate both lawyers, technologists, and entrepreneurs a range of issues that will make them successful, including understanding cutting-edge tech policy discussions. I'm happy to be co-moderating with Dan, and echo thanks for Jim Franklin and Pat Blumenthal. It's great to have Chris in town, as we'll get to. He is truly a rock star in this world of law, technology, and surveillance.
My name is Denise Maes, and I'm the Public Policy Director at the ACLU of Colorado. And in that role, I oversee all of our political and legislative agenda. And in this particular area, we're doing a lot of work at the state legislature to try to rein in government surveillance primarily.
Hi, Rob Hagens. I'm Vice President of IP Architecture here at Zayo. So I manage the engineering and growth of our IP backbone.
And Rob, you might also want to tell me your history with the internet.
So I've been working in the internet since really the late 80s. I worked for a company called Advanced Networking Services that ran the original NSFNet, which is National Science Foundation sponsored internet backbone. Then went to MCI, where we built one of the first commercial backbones, first commercial IP backbones back in the early 90s. That was kind of the same time that you may have heard other companies like UUNet or PSINet building commercial IP backbones. From there I went to level 3, where I met Dan and worked on building their IP backbone as well as their voice over IP and managed modem infrastructure and a lot of other engineering projects at level 3. And then I took a left turn into software and worked for a company that Dan was an investor in called Envision, that some of you may have heard of. Envision provided web-based video surveillance as integrated with point-of-sale transactions. And I learned a lot about security and surveillance and things like that at Envision before coming back here to join Dan at Zayo and get back into telecom.
All right, so let me start off with a question that will help level set the conversation. Chris, you're sort of our special guest here. Start with you. How did you get into these issues around government surveillance and the intersection of law and technology?
I guess there are two big things. One is I was obsessed with a TV show called The Wire.
How many people here have seen The Wire?
Yeah, big fans of The Wire.
It is the best TV show ever made. If you haven't, you need to get the DVDs. Have you seen it, Dan?
I've seen parts of it, but I have not seen it in that.
It's a great show.
It's unbelievable.
So I was obsessed with The Wire, and so I was doing this PhD. When you do a PhD, you have to pick this like small area where you're going to become the world's expert on that thing. And I have friends who are like the world's expert on the brown spotted newt, and they're not great at cocktail parties. And so I picked something that was as obscure and boring when I started it, which was how the government gets companies, phone companies and internet companies, to help them spy on their customers. And this was like something that no one had ever really looked at. You know, the spying in the movies is like the FBI shows up in an unmarked van outside your house, and they've got their headphones on, and they're like listening into the calls inside. And that's not how spying works. The way that spying works is that, you know, the FBI faxes a piece of paper to Google or Apple or Facebook and says, give me that person's messages, give me that person's emails. And so the person who's doing the spying is not a police officer or an FBI agent. They're an employee of Google's or Facebook's or Amazon's. And no one had really figured out why they do what they do, how they do it, how often they do it, why they say yes, when they say yes, why they say no, or when they say no. So I wanted to answer that question.
Except for Quest, because Joe Nacho made an issue of this in the government prosecution. If people remember it, he claimed the prosecution was motivated because Quest wouldn't cooperate with the government turning over such information. That was the sort of moment in the sun for this issue. I will say, as defending the academics who told Chris, don't do this topic, the reason not to do it is it's hard to get data on this topic. To write a good dissertation, you need data, you need information. By definition, this information is secretive, kept secret. It was not going to be an easy challenge for him to get over to be able to write about this.
Right, and so the way that I did my research was I moved to Washington, D.C., and I started going out drinking with the lawyers who work for the tech companies. And so this was good for two reasons. One, I was a graduate student and they had expense accounts, so they would buy all the drinks. And then after a few drinks, they would tell me, oh yeah, so this is how often we get these requests, or this is when we require a warrant, and this is when we require a subpoena. And as long as I didn't put their name in my research, if I just said, you know, Microsoft's policy is X, Google's policy is Y, everyone was happy. And so that was a way that I began to get this information. And so I finished my degree in 2012. I was the world's top expert outside of the government on how the US government spies on people. And then the next year, Ed Snowden came on the scene. And then everyone else learned what I'd been suspecting for some time. And so it's been a pretty crazy run.
So, Denise, Rob, you see this issue treated in popular press, TV shows. How many people here watch Homeland, by the way? Wow.
That's all?
That's... What kind of company are you running here?
Well,
You're working too hard.
Well, it's on in the evenings, and they need to work during the evenings.
All right. Rob, you watching Homeland?
Not yet, no.
All right, Dan, you better take this one then.
I've started.
Big fan of The Strain, though. Anyone who's The Strain fan?
Because I think Chris's point is a fair point. Other than The Wire, this is not a sexy issue. It's hard to understand. It's secretive.
Hey, what do you mean it's not sexy? I think it's really sexy.
Compared to what? The brown spotted newt? Sure. How have you both understood this issue, seen it depicted, and helped others understand it?
You know what? One thing that's most interesting about how Homeland depicts this issue of security, and the current season is probably as good as, it's early in the season, probably as good of a focus on this as any. And
It's okay.
oh, how do these work again?
This guy.
Zayo's a technology company.
Well, high tech, apparently. This is just a simple microphone.
Duct tape works every time.
So they do a very good job of depicting cybersecurity from both perspectives, both the perspective of those who zealously believe that privacy needs to be protected and governments need to be controlled, to those who are positive characters in the film, not the bad guys. They're amongst the good guys who are zealously using cybersecurity surveillance techniques, even illegal ones, but because they strongly believe and have proof, okay, this is a TV show, that they are saving innocent people's lives in the process. Right. So the conflict between the two is central to the whole series, really.
Yeah, and last season, just to give you context, because you'll have to get up this season, drones were featured in a similar way. It's not easy to do that, to try to give both sides a treatment that really does give a sense of the challenges. Denise?
It works the other way.
That was clever, yeah. No. I don't really quite know how to really get at that question or try to talk about it, but one of the things that I have found really fascinating, I think, is that long ago when some of the first surveillance or acts were ever passed by government, it was really intended for the government to be transparent, right? So that we, the citizens, could keep an eye on our government and make sure that they were acting in the people's interests. And what now has seemed to happen is really a flip, right? Where really the government is looking at everything that we do and we don't even know it. So the government has become less and less transparent as our lives have become more and more so. And that's how I try to talk to it with both legislators and with the general population and citizens. You know, today I was actually at a meeting before I came here talking about how we need to regulate and put guardrails around drone use. But when you really think about it, we ought to be talking about emerging technology more generally, because you know, local law enforcement gets their hands on new toys all the time, and when they get them, they want to use them, and they do it in the form or in the name of, just like our government does, in the name of public safety and security, which I always think is a false choice. And somehow we really need to make our government understand that and our citizens understand it, because the other piece that I worry about is there's this sense of, and I hear it all the time, well, we're not doing anything wrong, so, you know, what's the problem? But the point is that the Fourth Amendment was really created to protect the guilty and the innocent from government surveillance and government looking into your homes or into things that you do. So I would just say that it's important for us to be vigilant, and that's how I try to talk to everyday Coloradans about it, that if you're not vigilant and you don't stay on it, the government gets more powerful, and the more power they have, the more control they have over our daily lives, and I think that's a bad thing.
Can I just add something on this question of, like, you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't be worried? I think, particularly when you're watching shows like Homeland, it's very easy to think that the big governments, whether it's the US or the Russians or the Europeans, are only spying on targets, whether those are suspected terrorists or drug dealers or pedophiles or foreign leaders. You know, the US listening to the telephone calls of German Chancellor Angela Merkel. But it's not just those people who are targets of surveillance. There are two sort of other ways that surveillance happens. One is what's called bulk surveillance, where governments just collect everyone's information and put it in a big database because the technology is cheap enough and they might find a use for it later. And then what's called enabling surveillance. And this is the kind that scares me the most as an engineer. So two fascinating stories that have come out in the last year because of stories by The Intercept, which is Glenn Greenwald's organization. The GCHQ, which is the British version of NSA, hacked into the network of Belgacom, which is Belgium's largest phone company, and then also hacked into the network of a company called Gemalto, which is a Dutch-French manufacturer of SIM cards. So the little cards that are in your phone, and every SIM card has an encryption key that protects your communications as they go from your phone to the tower. And the British and the Americans want to spy on phone calls in Somalia or Yemen or Pakistan or China. And those calls are more difficult to spy on because they're encrypted. So the British spy agency systematically stalked and targeted the engineers who worked for Gemalto in order to break in and steal the encryption keys so they could then decrypt traffic of actual bad people in Somalia or Yemen. By the same token, there were probably bad people in Belgium who were, conspiring, and the US and UK wanted to know what they were doing, so they hacked into this Belgian company by impersonating LinkedIn to engineers working for Belgacom, convinced them to visit a malicious web page, delivered malware to their computer, hacked their computers, and then went from their computers to Belgacom's network. So why is this a problem? Well, I'm an engineer, and I didn't sign up to be a target for state-sponsored attacks just because I happen to work for an infrastructure company. And as a room full of people who work for what is an infrastructure company, you should be worried about the fact that you are fair game. It's not if you have nothing to hide, it's if your computer can be used as a gateway point to your employer, who also has nothing to hide but has something that might be useful, which is someone else's traffic. And what bothers me now is that essentially it's not just people who are doing bad things who are legitimate targets. It's not just foreign leaders who are legitimate targets. It's now any engineer or employee of any company that maintains or operates infrastructure is now fair game for all of the most powerful surveillance agencies in the world. I think that's really messed up.
So what's the right way to balance, and Rob, I'll let you start with this, and please feel free to add in what other thoughts here, to balance this national security need for information about bad people with collateral, or adverse effects that happen to innocent people. How should policymakers, government think about that?
I just wanted to say I've been building networks for 30 years or so, and you ask, like, how can we intercept all this data? How is it so easy to do that? And it took me back to years ago when I was in the IETF, which is the standards body that sets the definition of all of the protocols that are running over our backbones. And they were concerned about lack of security in all of the documents, and so they made a requirement that said every document has to have a section called security. And then, like for years, every RFC published under that section said security is not addressed in this memo. That was the one sentence under the security heading. So, for years and years and years, from a technology perspective, we haven't really addressed basic privacy kinds of concerns with the underlying technology, which makes it so easy to be able to snoop information. So to your question, I think that we need to start with basic privacy that people assume they have, or make it clear that whether they have it or whether they don't. At my previous company, Envision, we dealt with video and audio, and it was very interesting to hear people talking about, like, where can I put video cameras and what are the laws, and for instance, you could have a video camera in here because there's not an expectation of privacy, but you couldn't put a video camera in the bathroom because there is an expectation of privacy. And I think when you look at, like, all the digital media, it's not at all clear what level of privacy everyone should expect. Certainly, I think people think there's a lot more than there really is.
Well, Scott McNeely said, circa 2000, about privacy, there is none anymore, get over it. Chris, what's your reaction to that perspective?
So, let me tackle the previous question, which is how do you balance this, and then I promise I'll get to that. Yeah. So I think reasonable people can agree or disagree about the kinds of procedures that the government should have to follow before they search your house or hack your computer. I think, if you are in the civil liberties side, whether you're on the extreme left or you're the extreme right, and you don't want the government rifling through your stuff, you want the highest standard possible. And if you are on the national security side of things and you are scared of the ACLU and you want the easiest thing possible so it doesn't make life more difficult for law enforcement, cool. We can find a middle ground, and the way that in a democracy that we decide where we're going to be is our representatives in the House and Senate ultimately debate this, and then they pass legislation, and then those are the rules. And we can influence that by voting people in and out of office, and calling up your member and saying, please support this bill. That's, I think, the right role in a democracy to balance the security and privacy and civil liberties issues. But I think that everyone should be able to agree that regardless of where you are on privacy or surveillance, that we want our legislative bodies, we want Congress to know what's going on. And we want the courts, who are supposed to be looking at these applications for surveillance, to know what's going on. And that doesn't happen right now. Because of the extreme technical sophistication of the tools that these agencies are using, they're often far too complex for the average member of Congress to understand. And to be perfectly honest, the law enforcement and national security community have gone out of their way to hide a lot of the details about this stuff from Congress and the courts. And over time, these details come out, whether in the form of a front-page newspaper story in the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post, or WikiLeaks. And whether you think that Snowden was a whistleblower or a traitor, there should be no debate that the only reason that we now have laws prohibiting the national metadata program, where the FBI and the NSA were collecting a database of every telephone call that was made in the country, the only reason that program got shut down was because Snowden went to the press with that information. I think that we can agree or disagree about whether the government should get a search warrant or a lesser order or a higher order or a subpoena or whatever. But I think we should be able to agree that the courts and Congress should be told what's going on. And unfortunately, that doesn't take place right now. And so we are working really hard to make sure that the courts and Congress are kept in the loop so they can do their jobs.
So it's always good when you're on a panel to make it a little bit controversial. What is Congress's approval rating? 17%, maybe less. Here in Boulder, if we took the approval rating of our Boulder City Council, it would make Congress look extraordinarily high. It'd probably be 1%.
Elections are coming up, by the way.
Elections are coming up. We live in a very unsafe world today, and one that's, bizarre by standards of even a decade ago. And what is happening within the world, how technology is being used, not just to spy on you, but potentially to kill you. I'm not an expert in this field, but I'm not sure I 100% agree that I want the protection of our country to be solely in the hands of a Congress, which is hugely dysfunctional.
So it's not about being
or a court
solely.
system that might be years after the fact weighing in on something that needs to happen in real time. I'm not sure I disagree with you either, so I'm not taking a completely opposing view, but I think we live in a gray world, not a black and white world. In this case, part of the reality of the world we live in is one of terror that's building in momentum and taking more and more advantage of advancements in technology. And if we, in protecting ourselves, take too extreme of a view, we could find ourselves losing a lot of lives of people who deserve to live.
Let me add another fact to it, and for those who don't know this inside baseball, one of the challenges we've had in the current national security state is that a lot of the decisions around surveillance were made by what's called Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act courts, so FISA courts, that has no transparency around the decisions or transparency around how they work.
And only one party gets to argue before
And
the
only one
court,
party
which is
argues,
the government.
the government. So it's set up in a way that functions without the usual safeguards that ensure a rule of law. So the rule of law is that like cases get treated alike. It doesn't matter who you are. There's certain constitutional protections that you get. This FISA framework, I think now people viewed it as, at the very least, problematic and warranting some fixing. Dan's point is still a fair point, which is our Congress is not a model of data-driven, thoughtful, deliberative policymaking. And so we're in this really uncomfortable place where we
Much
have...
better than I did.
Well, let me just
it's all
add
we
one
have.
thing. I mean, I think that you raise a very, very good point, and it's certainly valid. And to a large extent, I don't necessarily want the civil liberties of our privacy to be decided by a majority of people that are elected to Congress. I get that, which is why we have a Fourth Amendment, which is why we have courts, which is why we give people due process, and that's why in the FISA that you just described, it is a one-sided. So if you really think that there's a big national security risk, well, you make your case, right? You make your case for the warrant, but you should make that case with all sides represented in a very open and transparent way, as opposed to the very secretive way that it's been done without really any true standard that is according to the Fourth Amendment that all of us know. And I always say this is like, it's so much easier for us to accept this, the bulk the metadata collection. We all kind of accepted that, but at the same time, if we had a police officer, peeping into your computer, the actual physical presence of somebody like that, we would get really nervous and we wouldn't like that. It's just the fact that it's like out there in the atmosphere that that we're not, as bothered by it because we don't see it, but that still doesn't make it okay. And it goes back again to what I said earlier about the fact that it's the government that ought to be transparent and not our lives. And the way that the NSA has acted and the way the FISA Act and the FISA courts work is they are not transparent, and we are. And that's what we have to change.
Let me give you an example that's from the law enforcement world, because it's very easy to focus on the NSA, but that's like super spying that won't affect most people's day-to-day lives. I mean, they may be collecting information about you, but they're not going to be dropping a bomb on your house unless you are a foreigner. So let's talk about domestic surveillance for a second, and this is a great example about how much the courts need to be told. So the
Everybody Donald Trump to the pan. Let's just drop bombs on your house.
I have way more hair than him, come on. So since 2002, the FBI has had a dedicated team of agents that hack into people's computers and phones. They're called the Remote Operations Unit. They're based in Quantico, Virginia, and they sit there and take over people's computers and turn on their webcams and turn on their microphones. And by the way, at the end of this panel, everyone should put a sticker over their webcam, because it's not just the FBI that has this capability, it's also stalkers and really sketchy dudes online who spy on Hollywood starlets and that kind of thing. This is like the one thing that you can easily do to improve your privacy is a sticker over your webcam. But so the FBI's had this.
That or walk around the house naked.
You do what floats your boat. So the FBI's had this dedicated team, and they say they haven't really talked about this stuff very much over the last few years, but they always said, oh yeah, we get court orders, we get warrants. So in 2006, the public learned that the FBI had hacked into the computer of a teenager outside Seattle who was calling in bomb threats, and they wanted to figure out where he was so that they could arrest him. Bomb threats at schools, bad thing. I'm not going to defend that practice. So they got a court order, but the court order didn't say we're going to hack into this kid's computer. They just said we want to send some software to this person's computer that will allow us to identify him. Well, last year, while reading 1,000 pages of redacted documents that had been released through a slow process, most of them like all blacked out, I stumbled on one page showing that the FBI, to trick this teenager into downloading their spyware, the FBI had impersonated the Associated Press. They had impersonated reporters, and they basically emailed them and said, hey, we're AP journalists, we're writing a story about you, here's a draft of the story, what do you think? Did we get your quote? Okay. And the kid, double-clicked on the Word attachment, and then boom, his computer was infected, and they could track him down. So the application for the court order never said, hey, we're going to impersonate the press. I think that there are certain positions of trust in a society, whether it's doctors, lawyers, priests, rabbis, and a few other things, where their very role in our society depends on trust. If you feel like there's a chance that your OBGYN might be a police officer, you may not go in for that important checkup. You may not call that suicide hotline if you think it's actually a hotline being run by the FBI to collect information they could use for a case. We shouldn't have the government impersonating those kinds of sensitive roles in our society, but they didn't tell the judge they were planning on doing that. And I think had they told the judge, there's no way the judge would have said yes. And so again, we can have a debate about what kind of piece of paper the government should get, and whether some kind of programs are appropriate, and whether the threats that we're facing are so extreme that we need these kinds of invasive activities. But I don't think there's any debate that the courts and Congress should be told what's going on. And you may not like the Congress that you have, but our founders created this three-party system of government where no one party trusts the other ones, because they believe that no matter how incompetent that one branch was, they would try and keep a check on the other branches of government. And we don't have a better system than the one we have. I'd like us to have a better system. I don't know what that would be, but as long as we have Congress, and Congress has oversight power and oversight responsibility, we should make sure that Congress knows what kind of surveillance local law enforcement are doing.
So one of the impacts of this recent set of disclosures of, let's call it, private company cooperation with government surveillance is the trust in these companies has gone down, with some pretty powerful damage to their brands and ability to compete internationally. Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because that's another piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, so when the Snowden stories first started breaking, and I know it's difficult, right? There have been like hundreds of Snowden stories, and it's very easy for people to just sort of tune out, and they all bleed into each other. But some of the interesting ones were the British spy agency GCHQ intercepting traffic between Google's data centers. Google, Yahoo, Twitter, Microsoft all had data centers in the US and data centers in Europe, and they had purchased lease line fiber cables linking those data centers, and they weren't encrypting the traffic between their facilities because they thought we're the only ones who were using these cables. And then level 3 communications, which was providing this traffic for these companies, apparently allowed GCHQ to do a full intercept of all of Google's internal traffic. So when the Washington Post revealed this, they showed some of these slides to some engineers at Google's security team who said things that could not be reprinted in the Washington Post. They were very upset. That harmed the reputation of those companies. A subsequent story revealed that the NSA had been opening up Cisco routers on their way out of the country, and through this program called interdiction, was opening the boxes up, installing malware on them, so that way when the Syrian government installed the Cisco router on their network, NSA was right there. We can have a debate about whether Syria is a legitimate target, and I think they are a legitimate target for the NSA. But should Cisco have the reputational harm associated with this as a result of that disclosure? Now Cisco has to keep warehouses full of equipment outside the United States because no European, African, or Asian company wants a router direct shipped from California anymore. You have GCHQ and NSA impersonating Facebook to their users. In order to deliver malware to people's computers, they were pretending to be Facebook, and that led to Mark Zuckerberg calling up the president and giving him an earful. There are multi-billion-dollar contracts that have been lost. Verizon, the backbone provider, lost the contract to provide the German parliament with their internet connection. Why the German parliament thought that it was a good idea to entrust their internet connection to a company that had so willingly helped the NSA, I don't know, but they cut that contract after the Snowden disclosures. And you only have to look in the front page of the newspaper. Tim Cook at Apple is positioning his company as a leader on privacy, and I think in an effort to compete against Google, which is about as far away from a leader on privacy as you can get. And so Tim Cook is, Apple's mobile devices are encrypted by default, which means if the police sees your phone, it's very difficult for them to extract data off of your device if you have a PIN number or password. If you send text messages through iMessage and to someone else who has an iPhone, they're encrypted by default in a very strong way that makes it difficult to wiretap. And if you use FaceTime to do a video or audio chat on Apple's platforms, your calls essentially can never be wiretapped, which is making a lot of people in Washington, D.C. very nervous. But that's Apple's way of saying, we don't want to be in the business of spying on our users. We think that we can deliver a more secure product than other players in the market, and we think that we can compete on security. And so in some ways, the Snowden disclosures have been good for Apple, while not so good for the companies whose products were either not very secure or had been intentionally weakened at the government's request.
Just to underscore the other side of this equation, Dan's point is, from the FBI's perspective, the reality that FaceTime is ungettable means that if you're a criminal terrorist and using FaceTime, the traditional warrants don't get you anything.
So now they have to hack your phone instead. So they can no longer go to Verizon or AT&T to wiretap you. So now they have to hack your phone. And okay, so let's have a discussion as a democracy about which agencies should be able to hack your phone. Should it just be the FBI? Should it be the local dog catcher? Should the IRS be able to hack phones if they think that you're engaging in tax fraud? Let's have a debate about who should use these powers and under which circumstances.
Right, and how they get access, and how they get that power, and the ability, the authorization to do so.
I want to get back to Rob's point because it's a really important one to highlight. The internet was created in an academic environment without much belief that it would become a major platform for commerce and mission-critical systems. Security was not part of the equation. Take us through that history a little bit, Rob. Let's reflect on the fact that part of this story is that we're living in an environment where the basic infrastructure, TCP/IP, wasn't built for the purposes we're now using it for.
Well, yeah. I mean, in the early days, the researchers that were building the internet and in the early internet backbones, the 110% of your focus was try to make it work. I mean, they're just, in a way, there really wasn't a lot of mind share. You know, at MCI, we were trying to build this backbone and take a portion of the internet traffic at the time, and every night the routers would crash, and every next day we'd get a new release of code from Cisco. You know, with all the testing that they did, they said boots in lab, which means it turns on, and then we'd put that out there and try to keep it growing. So there wasn't ever a lot of I think time or energy spent thinking about it, you know, and so then it to me it seemed like only when the internet started to get really big and people started thinking about, like, gee, is it really safe to use my credit card over the internet? You know, should I even do that? That companies started really focusing on security. And there's a long way to go. You know, a lot of the focus has been on the aspects of the internet that are kind of consumer facing. So, like, is my FaceTime encrypted, or is my email, you know, encrypted? But, you know, kind of beneath the covers, when you look at all the technology that just makes it all work, there's lots of vulnerabilities. One of them, you know, large ISPs like Zayo, we exchange routes with or reachability information with all the other large ISPs in the network, such as Level 3 or France Telecom or Verizon, and the fundamental protocol that you use for exchanging that information is not very secure and easily hacked. Today, that's really just caught by vigilance of a whole bunch of operators who would realize, gee, all of a sudden this network in Korea is claiming that they are Verizon. That must not be right. I'm going to turn it off and investigate. But it's kind of a scary thought, you know.
So should we put more resources to helping to solve that problem, and groups like NANOG working on it?
The ITF is working on it. Yeah, we're making slow progress on it, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Can I ask, like, so we're moving slowly to a world where a lot of our communications are encrypted. So email is going to be insecure for a long time, probably for a lot of boring reasons, but increasingly voice, text, video services are going to be encrypted, and the tech companies in California who are building most of these things, they don't want to build services that can be wiretapped. It's bad for business, it's bad for security. Every time there's a security flaw, they look bad, their customers have data that's stolen, and so we're increasingly seeing services that are encrypted. So the downside of this is it makes life more difficult for law enforcement and for the national security community. But think about the upside, think about the things that this brings. So, you know, let's say you're in a rural community and you don't have a full-time doctor there, but you do have a telemedicine program set up, you know, with FCC funding, and so there's a high bandwidth video link and a video conferencing system, and you can go in and talk to a doctor that's, you know, 100 miles away or 1,000 miles away. Well, should that video link be wiretappable? Well, maybe there's a criminal who's going to be conspiring with their doctor, but the alternative is, well, maybe people will be less willing to get naked in front of this camera and allow their doctor to examine them remotely if they think that someone could hack in and spy on them. Well, you know, I've used video-based counseling services before where my therapist was, you know, hundreds of miles away. It's awesome to be able to talk with your therapist via Skype, and Skype is in fact not as secure as FaceTime. You know, I think if people are worried about either the FBI or law enforcement or a criminal listening to their sessions with their therapist or their priest or their rabbi, they're going to be less truthful with those people, and then ultimately not get the help that they need. And so, you know, there are pluses and downsides associated with having communications that cannot be intercepted. But I think there are a lot of really, really good things that come from people being able to trust the technology that we give to them.
So I think you just answered the question before that I'm not sure you got to about Scott McNealy's take on privacy, which is get over it, you don't have any. You still believe that we can and should have privacy in today's information age?
So I think that there are sort of two classes of communications data. There's the contents of the communications, what you say, And then there's information about those communications, what computer scientists call metadata. So who you call at what time. We are moving full speed ahead to a society and a world where the contents of your communications will be encrypted. So what you say, to that suicide hotline will be encrypted. But the fact that you had a 2-hour call with a suicide hotline on a Friday night will not be protected and will be easier than ever for the government to get. And the fact is that if you call an abortion clinic to make, on their reservation number, it doesn't really matter what you're saying. And in fact, what you're saying is probably, hi, can I make an appointment for next week? Right, it's not actually that sensitive. It's the knowledge of who you're communicating with. If you, call a suicide hotline or a gambling hotline, what you're saying is not, in many cases, as sensitive as the mere fact that you're making that call. Right. We have an amazing amount of technology that is being rolled out now that's protecting the contents of communications, but we don't know how to hide metadata very well. We also just don't know how to hide location data. There's no way to have a cell phone that connects to a phone network and not have the phone network know where you are. And so what that means is the government can go to the phone companies whenever they want, following the appropriate process, which in some states is a warrant and in some states not, and get your location data. And we don't have anything on the horizon that's going to change that. And so, whether that is a net improvement or decrease in privacy, I don't know. Certainly the big data tools that exist to allow for analysis of metadata are only getting better and better. And you think about tools like Palantir and others that allow the government to analyze, millions or billions of records and look for the needle in the haystack. Those tools are getting better and they're getting more and more data, but they're losing the contents of the communications.
Just the one thing I was going to add is that we have talked a lot about how all of this access impedes on your privacy, but it also has a chilling effect on associations and what you do with, right? And so that's like another element that's bad about the government being able to access this. It's not just your privacy, but how that affects your associations, where you go, what you do, and just like you said, do you not, maybe you don't call the suicide hotline. So there is a tendency for that sort of surveillance to also chill your speech, your associations, where you go, what you do, because they have access to that information. So I just wanted to add that.
One quick point for those who are interested in law, how to take legacy protection. So a famous case involving the NAACP in Alabama, where they tried to get access to the membership list and were denied access under the right of free association. How do you protect that precedent in today's digital world is a fascinating question. For those interested in it, the best book to read is still Larry Lessig's Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. Larry Lessig, by the way, is actually running for president right now and has raised more money than Martin O'Malley. So
I'm going to take a leap here and assume that you guys think the metadata should be highly private and protected. Is that a truism?
So I'm a computer scientist.
Just yes or no?
No, hang on, this is not a yes or no question.
Okay, so
this is not a presidential
let me
debate.
finish my thought then.
All right.
Okay, to what extent, if the policies that you would like to see adopted, to what extent do you worry about causing more harm than good? To what extent are you worried about the people aren't calling the suicide hotline, they're calling their terrorist friends and plotting an attack? And we removed nearly every way of understanding that, decoding that, and protecting ourselves. And notice the way I'm asking the question is not, well, that's up to the judges to decide or Congress to decide. I'm saying if you had it your way, if it was your policies, to what extent do you think you've taken it too far?
So the reason the answer is complicated is because the line between metadata and content is increasingly becoming blurry. I'll give you a fantastic example. There's some researchers at UNC, University of North Carolina, who looked at NetFlow data. You guys use NetFlow, and so hopefully some people in the room know what NetFlow records are. Records of packets. Which computer sends which packets to which other computer. And so they looked at these NetFlow records of a Skype conversation. And just by looking at the amount of data that was being sent during a Skype conversation, and the delays, when a lot of data was being sent and when there weren't a lot of delays, they could start to guess at words. So it turns out that just based on metadata, on information about the size of the packets and how many of them, like so when you're talking, there's data being sent. When you're not talking, there's no data. And some words include more data than others, I guess. I'm not a linguistics expert. But they were able to guess with a high reliability initially the language, and then ultimately the words themselves, without listening to the words, just based on how much information was being sent over the wire and when. So that's a crazy result. I mean, it's really amazing research. The first paper was called, it's like Hooked on Phonics, because computer scientists think they're funny in that way. And the first paper was, the second paper was like Alice or Alejandra, because they were guessing between Spanish and English. You know, as I said before, the abortion clinic or the suicide hotline is a great example. You know, through metadata, you're learning this really sensitive information that in many ways is just as sensitive, if not more sensitive, than the content. And so it ultimately becomes the content. It reveals what you're doing there. So I personally think that metadata should get the same protection as content under the law. And the other reason for that is, as a computer scientist, I often have more faith in technology than the law. The law moves slowly, the courts move really, really slowly. Policymakers and judges often don't understand the nuances of how the tech works. And so it's really exciting that like, you know, we're having a debate in Washington right now about whether the government should have to get a warrant to read your emails. And we still haven't required that yet.
So you're not worried much at all about
Well,
the terrorist thing?
Well, I'll get to that. But I like the fact that I can encrypt my emails today, and then it doesn't matter what kind of piece of paper the government has to get, because my emails are essentially off limits. I like the fact that technology can protect you where the law cannot, or where the law has failed to protect you. And what frustrates me about metadata is we don't have the technology to protect metadata. And so that's an argument for making sure that the law really, really protects you, because there's nothing else that will keep you safe there. When it comes to your question about, you know, the balance of do we go all the way for law enforcement, national security, or all the way for privacy? You know, I think in the past this was a debate about terrorists versus civil liberties. And I think as cybersecurity has started to become this major concern, now the debate shifts, because there's no way to design a system that will allow law enforcement to get access when they need it, that will keep sophisticated nation-state adversaries like the Chinese out. And so I think we have to pick, which threat are we more worried about? Are we more worried about the Chinese and the Russians hacking our networks and stealing our IP and stealing our government secrets? Or are we more worried about catching drug dealers or other criminals? There's no silver bullet that gives you an easy wiretap and keeps the Chinese out. And ultimately, I think that the threat posed by hackers is worse.
Has there been any example where you've found yourself in a bit of a moral dilemma because you know that you're advocating something that could have an unintended consequence that might be far worse than what you're trying to protect?
I mean, so let me try and answer that. You know, I've spent 5 years trying to encourage tech companies to encrypt everything. So we started with Google, then Twitter and Yahoo and Facebook and law firms and US government agencies. And one of the consequences of that is that you know, now there's no easy way for school libraries to be able to filter, you know, pornography from searches, because Google search is now encrypted, so your school cannot see what your kids are searching for without installing spyware on the kids' computers. You know, there are downsides to encryption in that it allows insiders to leak information or to steal information more easily without the defenders of the network, being able to see it. But on net, I think I want to live in a society where everything is secure. I would rather have complete confidentiality versus complete surveillance.
Let's give people in the audience a chance to answer questions. Maybe I should bring the mic out. Is that for protocol?
Let's zoom out a little bit. My Social Security card, if I could find it, still says not to be used for identification purposes. So obviously, and you've given examples of how things have changed with the internet over the years, when nobody thought about confidentiality and privacy. What kind of larger policy could you have to look at something every 5 years or 10 years? What would you build in where somebody, policymakers, Congress, somebody had to look at it and say, have things changed? Do we need new laws?
How do we update our laws in an era of technological change?
I mean, I think it's really hard to get policymakers to deal with difficult problems. And the Social Security number is an example of a difficult problem where people have known for decades that we shouldn't be using this as an identifier, and it's only been sort of in the age of data breaches that we're now slowly starting to realize the impact of that. I think another example, many of you probably now have credit cards with chip and pin, a little chip in them. So we were the last major Western country to move to this chip system, which is more secure, protects you against the payment terminals being hacked or having malware on them. In other countries, you had strong regulation saying, okay, on January 1st of this year, everyone gets the chip, everyone gets the pin. In the US, we didn't have regulation that imposed digital security obligations on the payment card industry. Instead, it was Visa and MasterCard sort of setting their own requirements, something called PCI. And so it was easy for people to push the ball down the road. The impact of that on your lives is that we don't have chip and pin still. We have what's called chip and signature. The banks in the US were worried that consumers in America could not remember a PIN number.
There's some good reason for that.
So actually what it boils down to is, in the US, we didn't have a date where everyone got chip and PIN. Instead, individual banks sent out the cards as they were sort of updating, sending out new cards over time. And the individual companies were worried that if they sent you a chip and PIN card and you forgot your PIN number, you would use the other card in your wallet from one of their competitors. And so that sort of the lowest common denominator was, okay, we're not going to have a PIN number. The end result is that America ends up with the least secure version of the payment card security system that everyone else in the world has. And it means that when you go to Canada or Mexico or Europe on vacation, you're not going to be able to buy a subway ticket from the machine because you're not going to have a PIN number that works. So the problem here is our government just stood by and said, all right, someone else will figure it out. And we didn't get a good solution. What we got was a half-assed solution. And we got a half-assed solution with Social Security numbers, and we're going to get one with all these other difficult tech issues.
Right. And I think that, just to echo that, it's really frustrating, to go to the state legislature and start out with what you think is like the most ideal bill, if you will, that's going to really put all the right guardrails that we think are really important. And then by the end of the process, the bill is watered down to maybe a little bit of what you wanted because it's all such a part of a compromise, and there's always pushback, and there's always this, and there's always that. Sometimes I think my goal now is we shoot really, really high, so we get something maybe kind of in here, instead of maybe starting here thinking that we're going to immediately get consensus and then end up somewhere at the bottom level. But I think just what Chris said at the beginning is so true. It's really hard to get lawmakers to make hard decisions, and a lot of this stuff they don't get, and so it's complicated. Oh, yeah, sorry.
I would just add to that and what Dan had said that, I think in this decade, I don't know for how many more, I hope not a lot, but our government is incapable, Congress incapable of trying to make what was the term you used, fact-based,
Data-based
informed decisions.
Yep.
And so I think it comes down to private enterprise, right? People might buy more Apple products because they prefer the security. I know a lot of people that will never create a Facebook login because they're worried about data security. So I know we're running towards the end here. I just wanted to make ask one other question. How many people know what a password manager is? few people, that's good. The reason I ask, so a password manager is kind of a super password keeper. So what you do is you log on to the password manager with one password you remember, and then you use random passwords for every single other account that you have. That's a really good thing to do. We've talked a lot about technology and encryption, but the fact is that a lot of us have the ability or let potential third parties gain access to our systems just because you're using the same password for all 200 of your accounts, and it's whatever you came up with 4 years ago with a new number at the end. So LastPass is a great one. I have no interest in that one other than a happy user.
And that one password that you have to have for that password manager, when you see the word password on a screen, replace it in your head with passphrase. So it's much better to have, I love going for long walks and eating ice cream than, 7493 question mark uppercase S. You might think that like the random password is stronger, but every additional character you add to your password or passphrase doubles the difficulty of someone guessing it. And so it's way better just to have a bunch of words with spaces, like a sentence, than to have this like difficult password to remember.
So you remember nothing else from this talk?
Sticker on your webcam, passphrase.
Yeah.
Love the ACLU.
All right, we have one last question.
You've addressed some of the issues around how if there's insecurity in the systems, whether it's just there or whether it's actually even mandated by government, like mandated backdoors, that both reduces trust in the business model. It also opens up the risk to things like cyber terrorism. But even in terms of traditional terrorism, there are claims out there. The NSA's claimed that there's like 54 terrorist attacks that have been stopped by their work. What is the actual reality or status of those claims?
That is a spectacular question from my colleague in the second row. Look, I think, the NSA has a difficult job. And there's no one who goes to work at the NSA in the morning thinking, I can't wait to spy on some innocent Americans today. Right? The FBI has a hard job. All of these people have really difficult jobs. And ultimately what it boils down to is that they are willing to do certain things that I think are inappropriate because they think that their particular task is more important than some other things. When it comes to the claims of terrorist threats that have been thwarted by domestic surveillance programs, the president appointed an independent body to evaluate those claims, and they found that the best story they had was finding a taxi driver in San Diego who'd sent a few $1,000s to Al-Shabaab in Somalia. That was it. A conspiracy to aid a terrorist group. That I don't think is sufficient to justify creating a database of every telephone call in the country.
We're not going to end on that.
Why not? It's a great one.
So your theory is over the last 15 years, the closest thing we came to thwarting, that word, a terrorist attack is a $200.
No. So I'm saying this particular program that involved collecting a database of every telephone call in the country, when an independent body, an independent committee that included the ex-director of the CIA on it, looked at it, the best success story the government had was this guy who'd sent money to Al-Shabaab. Now, there are plenty of other things the NSA does that have been useful.
Was this under Eric Holden? Is that who did that?
Eric Holder. So what I'm saying is this particular program was ineffective. Whereas the 702 program, which is commonly called PRISM, which was a program where the NSA was getting data from Google and Facebook and all these other companies about their foreign customers, that program contributes has contributed, I think, more than...
Was that grossly ineffective? Don't you think they would have stopped doing it on their own
No,
a long time
no,
ago? Why
because-
would they?
TSA is still around.
Yeah. So,
Why would they expect they're wasting their own personal time?
because it's not
That's the best thing that ever happened.
because there's free money for national security in Washington. But I would say the PRISM program, the NSA says contributes like more than 50% of the information to the president's daily national security brief. Reading the emails of foreign government leaders is probably pretty useful. But it turns out that keeping records of every American's telephone calls is not very useful. Particularly, the last thing I'll say is, if you take the government at their word, that what they're interested in are people in the US calling people in Somalia, no American calls Somalia from their landline phone paying $7 a minute for international long distance. The way that people call their families in the developing world is through calling cards and Skype and these other cheap VoIP-based systems. That's not what the 215 program is, as far as we've been told publicly. It's about wireless and landline telephone records, not calling cards and VoIP systems.
Right. I mean, in fact, it was right after Snowden's revelations that a lot of the NSA started to talk about just that. Oh, look at all of these terrorist, attacks that we were able to prevent, and it was two of thwarted. Thank you. And it was actually two senators on the Senate Intelligence Committee at the time, Wyden and Udall, who raised their hand and they said, no. I mean, we're pretty privy to a lot of the information that the NSA is doing. We're pretty privy to this program because of our role in the Senate Intelligence Committee, and we really can't see anything that had been stopped at that time. And then the independent commission that you're talking about got put together and found that one cab driver.
So I'm glad we stimulated this conversation. We do have to end, but let me end on this note. We need in public policy, government, state, local, federal, entrepreneurial leadership and interdisciplinary collaboration, particularly from people with technical backgrounds. If that is of interest to any of you, please come talk to me. It's a passion project of mine. We can't give up on government. It's simply too important. I know it's frustrating and there's a lot to criticize. The truth is we will continue to have a government, and the challenge for us is to make it as effective as it can be. And for those who want to talk more about that, let me know. I want to thank Rachel, Dan, Zayo. This Thrive Series is wonderful bringing us in. It's really a terrific conversation. Jim, great call. Pat, thank you. Those interested in talking more with Chris, Denise, others from the ACLU can stay afterwards. Otherwise, folks got to get back to work. So thanks, everybody.